What, this is a 2-hour webinar?
I'm sure everyone would appreciate that on a Friday afternoon, Nelson. I appreciate all the people who have joined us already. Thank you so much for sharing your Friday with us. I think we should go ahead and get started because we are recording and we can send this to anyone who is not currently in. So Q&A is open, chat is open. I know that Nelson is manning the chat box, so feel free to chat in there. What we are happy to talk about today is our impact of COVID-19, our report that really primarily comes from our performance tracker system at Johnson Consulting. And what we did last year is we always do an annual report on the statistics that are coming from our system. And the system takes in contract information from multiple POS systems. So anyone who is a client of ours, we're taking in all of their contract information, and that's broken down by case type. So we have a lot of very detailed information about what people are buying and where they're buying it, and what those trends are. And then in addition to that, we have customer satisfaction survey information to match up to those contracts. So we know what people are feeling about the experiences they're having based on the type of call or case that they have or contract that they've purchased into. So really excited. What we did last year, right when we went into quarantine, we knew that this year, 2020 was going to be different. So we basically said we had just delivered our 2019 report, and we said, look, let's just keep track of the data as it's coming in. And we didn't define a time. We said, let's wait until we get further down into the year and we'll let the data define what our reporting should be. And that's what we did. We looked for kind of a breaking point, and we said at the start of March, obviously. So let's kind of look at where it's going, where we're going to see some trends changing. And so what we're presenting today is information based on just the first 3 quarters, because by the end of the 3rd quarter, we saw that some, like most of the stuff was kind of tailoring back off. Most of our trends were going back to a little bit back to normal. And also because we wanted to get this information into people's hands, like what was the actual impact in those first 3 quarters of 2020. And to put that in perspective, we looked at over 107, almost 108,000 contracts. So it's a lot of data to be able to look through in both the US and Canada. So, and we take the data and we send it off to an independent research firm who actually comes back with this information. So we try, as much as we can to make sure that this isn't skewed information. We weren't looking for anything. We just said, let's let the data speak to us. So Nelson, I know we have some overarching key findings in what we saw in those first 3 quarters. You kind of want to highlight those?
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, in fact, it's interesting to be able to finally kind of say that we're looking at COVID in a retrospective. I know for so many of the funeral and cemetery professionals out there, it's certainly not in your rear view mirror. But in order to look at this information now, what we feel is still a timely topic that we'll learn from not only during this time, but I think if you follow the news and any kind of futuristic expectations, pandemics are probably not going to be going away. In fact, if anything, they're almost guaranteed to be a recurring factor for many of us. What we were looking at, I would say, if anyone was going to project out for the next 10 years, some of the big issues that we were looking at is a drop in available licensed professionals, difficulty in recruiting and retaining funeral directors and cemeterians. We also saw ongoing reduction in sales averages, primarily to a case shift mix, and the inevitable ever-increasing death rate. We've been talking about baby boomers since I was in mortuary school, but not only are the baby boomers going to eventually come, but when you think about it, every generation is a multiplier behind them. So we're going to see constant and continuous death rate increases. And so you've got that 3-way combination of more death calls requiring more people, which are ever increasingly more difficult to find, and with a ever reducing revenue, to be able to pay for those employees that just because of the law of supply and demand are going to be more costly. We saw the next 10 years probably compacted into the last 10 months because we saw all that with the pandemic. Certainly an increase in call volume, certainly a reduction in sales average. And again, we are left with the same amount of people trying to do a greater call volume. And what took a lot of people out of the day-to-day mix were themselves being quarantined or falling sick to the pandemic. So that's the environment that we're operating in. And some of the big things that we took away, as you can see here, is families still see funerals were important. They still were looking for proper ways to say goodbye. I think it was very poignant. We read a lot of comments from families, and they were very appreciative for the most part. There was the only disappointment was that they couldn't have the funerals they wanted. But oftentimes the comments went on to recognize the fact that the funeral home staff did everything they could under their powers to be able to provide what they could. So it certainly was appreciative, but again, disappointed because they couldn't have the type of services that they wanted. Again, we looked at, there's the first wave and what came of those. The transition from something as a thumbnail that we often look at in terms of cremation rates. Whatever you have as your base cremation rate, cremations overall, you typically would see about 50% of those are direct cremation. What we saw in 2020 is that that portion of overall cremations went from 50% up to anywhere from 68 to 72% during the height of 2020. So certainly when people were in a position where they had to make arrangements, and sometimes when it wasn't expected, or in certain populations where families were hit particularly hard, you can well imagine that sometimes they were looking at multiple funerals in a very short period of time. And also given the fact that some of them had a very unknown employment future ahead of them too. So that drove cremations heavily in the way of direct cremation. Discounts remained consistent. I think what a lot of funeral homes reported that I saw was a big piece were pre-needs that came and matured. And when people couldn't really provide the services they wanted, the first wave was very much, I tell you what, let's do it. Let's plan for a funeral and we'll do it sometime in the future. But inevitably, as the months went on, and of course, economic constraints for families, a lot of them would come back and say, we're just not going to have those services. And I think that in much of what we saw was found in the financial side, especially for the clients that we see that so many of them were writing pretty big refund checks later in the year. Mm-hmm. And then again, as you can, you see the whole country, and not to be political in this in any way, shape, or form, but we see that our country in general has seen a separation between urban and rural. And it is somewhat the same case here. We had higher cremation rates in the urban areas, and we see this across the board whenever there's a reduction of one-to-one involvement, when there's that lack of relationship building interaction between funeral homes and cemeteries and the people that they serve, satisfaction goes down. And it really underlines, again, why that is so much of it's an experiential time. And the more that we can work with families, the more that we can provide our insight as to provide meaningful services, it increases families' satisfaction. But in these cases, COVID took away that from most of us.
Yeah, and I think the bright light in all of that, Nelson, kind of the overarching thing that we can look to that is positive for the future is that first statement there, funerals are important. And the fact that when people didn't feel connected, when you just had direct cremation, that's when the satisfaction levels came down. So that tells us people need our services. People want more. we just have to find a better way of messaging that outside of COVID, right? Or capitalize on what we've learned from that to be able to continue to, serve at the highest levels and offer at the highest levels. So so much great information here. And there's so much to uncover that we want you to know that we've got this recording and these slides, and also there's a complete report to this. We're just giving you some highlights. So if you're interested in that, make sure you email us, chat us, contact us, and we can send you the full report so you can read for yourself and see some of the full statistics that came back for us. For the rest of today, what we really want to focus on and highlight is just in general what client satisfaction looked like in that time period that we're talking about. Takeaways of some marketing discussion points, some things that came up from the statistics about maybe how you might want to shift your marketing strategy based on what we've learned, and then looking at how do you take some of this information to better train employees so that we can make sure that we're servicing at those higher levels and continuing to improve based on what the customers are telling us that they want. So let's dig into that a little bit. So let's just start with client satisfaction. And so ultimately, the first thing we saw, and Nelson already hit on this, is just, decline in family satisfaction, specifically in that second quarter of last year when the pandemic just hit, when everyone was in a panic and didn't know where to go, or all the restrictions were the tightest about what kind of services we're having. What else did we learn about this, Nelson? And especially in that initial contact, what are the numbers telling us about, people's dissatisfaction with things like the initial contact?
Well, initial contacts, for as long as we've been doing surveys, has always been the what I want to say, the lowest ranked service portion of the overall service. As a profession, that is the place where we have the most to learn and the most to gain. And it obviously was impacted even greater because for those that maybe have a higher level of confidence, or their repetition on the phone is something that has honed their skills, then you go into a pandemic where all bets are off, and now you're not only talking to people about the way in which we're going to get access to them, come into their homes, and then when they come into our funeral homes or our cemeteries to make plans, you just didn't have the regular cadence of what you would use to say, and it was also confusing. I will say this, and I'm so proud and particularly impressed with the funeral directors and the cemeterians out there who made the shift and adjusted to what the circumstances were. Several clients who would actually put on their websites a video kind of walking people through what to expect when they walked into their funeral homes, or they would give them a written summary of what would be different going forward with arrangements. So I think that was huge for funeral homes and cemeteries to explain people on the front end of what the experience was going to be like, and also for the general public coming in for visitations as well.
I love that, because it always comes down to managing expectations, right? So heading it off before they even get theirs is probably good for any time. And
Yeah.
COVID highlighted that. So some of the things that we can learn from that are, specifically in Performance Tracker, or if you have some data that you can pull out of your own systems, it's really important to understand. And that's why we have a system like Performance Tracker available, is like, you want to be able to understand how people are feeling about the experience based on that particular case type, to be able to say, direct cremations is where the satisfaction level was the lowest. Really, the other thing is, when you get negative feedback, or where we're seeing the decline in satisfaction, to be able to take all those negatives together and say, what is the common theme here? Was it just because we were limited on the type of services we could provide? Was it the way our staff was handling that initial contact or the phone call, that they didn't have as much information there? Or was it that our website didn't have pricing or details that people needed in order to take the next step? Really understanding where, as your own business, understanding where the issues are is the reason that we collect this feedback, right? if you don't do something with it. I always hear people when I say, oh, we do surveys, people say, oh, we do surveys. And I'm always asking, well, what do you do with them? And they're like, oh, we're really happy when we get really positive ones, or we only get positive and negative. And then, that just tells us what we already know. And it's like, well, that's the first step, right? But if you already know, what are you doing about it, right? And how do you take trends and look for bigger solutions and look for what you need to change? And I think that's a key thing that's just even more highlighted in this environment, or from what we learned. So I think we should probably touch on some of the marketing, takeaways that we learned from what was happening in COVID. And I know you know this, Nelson, and it's probably not surprising to most people, but just like historically, that initial contact has been kind of where low survey scores are historically, and we've been doing this for 14 years. The top reasons that people select a funeral home are typically, and cemeteries as well, it's typically the same thing. It's the family has legacy there. They've previously been served. It was a convenient location. Maybe they already have a pre-arrangement. You have a great reputation in your community. And a lot of times they've got, an acquaintance with somebody who works on your staff, which is why it's important for everybody to be engaged in the community. But there's nothing different here, right? We didn't say anything different with COVID, Nelson. In general, people were still coming to the funeral homes they were going to, or cemeteries, because of these 5 things. The trend didn't change. So not much to learn there, except for that those are all important things to pay attention to, right?
And I think what you saw, if you go back to that slide just very quickly, you'll see that there was some minor incremental drop-offs from 2019, and I think that is representative of the major increase in death calls. And the populations that were being hit. We saw, for the most part, 15 to 20% increase in call volumes for a lot of firms. And I think what you're seeing there is where people would normally previously, they're going with the firm that they previously used. Some of that is just because these deaths occurred in families prematurely, and maybe they didn't have previous experiences with them. And the other thing I think is, it's always great when you see a survey like ours, and then you compare it to probably the next most comprehensive survey is the one that National Funeral Directors puts out. And they survey this same set of questions, and theirs is identical within percentage points of everything that we come up with. So 2 very highly respected and very comprehensive surveys between what we put out and what NFTA puts out. So very, very reliable information here.
Very, very interesting. And I think the one thing that you might be able to look at is in that Q3, where you're like, your point is previously served families coming down just a tad. I mean, still in line with that second quarter, but definitely different, a little bit different from 2019. And then acquaintances, it gets picked up in reputation, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Really comes back down to, social reputation and, making sure that people are talking about you in a positive way. And so this is the one, this information to me is the one that's more compelling. It's, we already know that we had more cremations, and especially direct cremations. We've covered that. But what happens there is that it's not a lot, but when cremation is the choice or is the priority, there is a change in those other reasons that people show up. Not the top 5, but down at the bottom, you're starting to see these trends change a little bit. And I think all of them are very interesting. To me, recommended, that's a big change, right? So that goes back to those referrals. It goes back to that online reputation. It goes back to, who's talking about you and saying positive things. And then we just talked about this, the initial experience or the initial phone call, you're calling in and you didn't give the answers, or your staff isn't answering what the questions that this cremation consumer is looking for. And that's a pretty big deal, because that's from a 4 to a 9% increase is pretty big. And then the other one to me is websites. Now we're only talking about a 2%, but it's doubled, right? So how much information, and is it good information that's on your website, right, Nelson? I mean, I think you said there was an increase from the year prior to that as well.
Yeah, there's the slide that we just looked at and this one are probably very insightful for everybody out there. I always, when talking with clients, I refer to the two slides, and it's interesting. We don't create these slides, we just report them. So the first slide that we looked at, when you look back at that, there all those reasons are what I often referred to as maintenance type reasons. It's based on history and reputation and location, all those things that are already in place. When I look at this, I always look at this as the opportunities. These are all the growth building opportunities that we see that people are saying, oh, I selected your funeral home or cemetery. And unfortunately, these are always much, much lower than those other ones. And not to say that we rest on our laurels, but I think that if we were to focus in on these and realize that they could be potentially as great as the other ones, we obviously we don't know everyone in the community and we're not close to everyone. We don't have a pre-need on everyone. However, you look at this list and it does pertain to the entire population of your community or in your market area. These are important areas to look at. And you're right, your recommendations, that's huge. I mean, we know that when a business grows, it's built off the advocacy of families that have served us before or we've served before, and they're telling other people to, oh my goodness, if anything ever happened, go see Lori. She will take care of you and your family like nobody else. That kind of advocacy, that's a growth building opportunity like all these other ones are. You mentioned about websites, and again, you could dismiss these numbers that are saying, "Wow, it's only 2 and 4%." But in 2018 to 2019, websites doubled in their significance and doubled again in 2020. I think certainly the pandemic and the whole way that people went about finding funeral homes or engaging with funeral homes or attending funerals obviously inflated the value of websites. But this is something I think is very interesting is websites leapfrogged all other forms of advertising for the first time ever this last year. And when you look at a budget, and we always recommend, you want to get into websites. Everybody's come to the belief now that I've got to have a website and I've got to have a highly functioning website. And yes, you do, but it costs a lot of money. It's not always that you have to spend more, it's that you need to reallocate it in the areas that it's most effective for you. And I think it's a good time for everyone to really look at their advertising budgets. And I would never advocate people pulling away from their churches, but you think about the money that this last year was spent on church bulletins, and churches were closed down for months at a time. Again, you can't pull that money back, but in hindsight, there was a lot of advertising spent that no one ever had a chance to utilize because they weren't even in attendance at their churches because of COVID. So again, websites are going to be a big thing. There's no indication at all that it's going to subside. It's just my guess is it will continue to double and double and double, and it's certainly putting other forms of advertising behind it.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to watch. Exactly. You're right. That is going to continue to double because we're saying this is where cremation is a priority. Customers are different there. It is your front door, the same way that your front door is. And so how that looks, and more importantly, the information people take from it is more important than ever. So I know there's a statistic, I think it's 87% of people will click away if they don't have the information, immediately see the information that they're looking for. And I know like pricing is always a touchy thing, but something like that where, typically a cremation consumer is looking for that information. It could be at 2 a.m. And if it's not there, they're going to click away, and 87% of it will, and they'll go find the information somewhere else. And that's where I think we're going to start seeing some shifts away from that family's been served there in the past to I went there because of the website. But I'm excited to keep watching that trend and how people can make improvements there. So,
Lori, maybe before we go away, we've gotten a question from Jennifer and wondering about social media specifically. And I know that's huge on the J3 Tech side of things. You might want to address how we're going to look at social media going forward.
yeah, we haven't in the past had any ability to look at social media rankings or measure that, because our system and the data that we've collected has always primarily been focused on the customer experience and then what they're actually purchasing. We are really excited because last year we did upgrade our platform, and now we are able to pull in. And so starting at the fourth quarter of last year, we started to pull in social statistics. So we can pull in Google reviews, Yelp reviews, and we actually pull all that data. We're basically scraping from like a Google. Anyone, if you have your funeral home, we're taking all of your social information and your metrics and how well you're performing, and we take all of those social reviews for your competitors, and we actually show all this on a dashboard so you could see how you're comparing against your competitors. And what's really cool about that is, for our 2021 report, once we get to the end of this year, we'll be able to have a full year's worth of information from everyone that's in our system to say how are people performing, and kind of what is being said about these organizations, tying it back to the kind of cases that they have, tying it back to the satisfaction surveys as well, because sometimes people could be dissatisfied with something, but that doesn't mean they aren't a promoter of yours. And so we unfortunately don't have any statistics for 2020, but we are really looking forward to being able to present those in 2021. But thanks for the question, Jennifer.
There's an Anthony also asked, and you might be better able to understand, wants to know if you'll be doing retargeting.
We don't, because we're just delivering data, right? So that's our purpose, is to just be able to deliver the data so that you could take it and figure out how you want to go ahead and market to your customers. Okay, so what are some other takeaways that we found with what people are purchasing? So when we think about how we can apply this to our marketing strategy, Nelson, I know, like we talked about the average sale per case last year went down a little bit. I know that isn't surprising. I don't know if it's super significant. What else? And, one of the things I think is interesting is those monuments, but do you have any other feedback on what happened with cases in general, just contract revenue?
Yeah, in fact, early on, I would say it was probably late March, 1st of April, we were able to actually start reforecasting 2020 for clients that had Performance Tracker. And the reason we were able to do that, we knew automatically that any traditional burial service was not going to be a traditional burial service anymore. It was now going to be a graveside service or some kind of immediate burial service. And we knew what those averages were, and we projected out the case volume, and we were able to come up for companies with a new target for revenue with, in many cases, you're talking significantly less sales average, by thousands of dollars sometimes, especially when you saw the new volume, that 20% extra that was coming in, that really had no capacity whatsoever to be a traditional burial. It was now going to be a cremation of some nature, and like we said before, higher than normal average, that it was going to be a direct cremation. So the number that you see there, the drop from 48 to 4,000, that's a significant number in any regard, and especially higher volume firms. You're closing in on $1,000 less, so it doesn't take you long when you're saying, I do 100 calls, it's $100,000 difference. So that was the big piece. I think we both, our ears perked up when we saw this for monuments, and I know you have a little more detail on that as well. And I don't know how to get all Dr. Phil about it, but I know early on, a lot of clients were reporting that they were having graveside services, which much higher sales averages of caskets, having high-end caskets for an immediate burial service. And again, I remember the first time I heard that, and then the second and the third, and for months I was early on. That's what I was hearing, and you can't help but wonder that, there is that value side for people and what they want to do, and when they couldn't have a service, they were spending the money in a fashion that they thought was, honoring that person has died, and really, how can you not think about a monument in that case? So I would even reevaluate my whole marketing strategy in terms of merchandise. And if you aren't currently doing monuments, look into it. If you think of monuments as just an ancillary sale, and well, it's great if you get it, but we're not going to live off that. Rethink that, because people are going to be looking for opportunities. And maybe it's not just monuments, maybe it's other forms of memorialization. Maybe revisit the thummies again, and revisit all the different merchandise items that help people memorialize a person. I think it's well worth the time and effort to think that through. And yeah, it's not going to replace $800 difference, but you can see it makes a little bit of a difference. If you can recoup 500 out of an $800 loss, certainly worth your time and effort to think about those.
Yeah, and I know I love like speaking in terms of kind of as the business owner, how can you capitalize on this information? What I think is really interesting is the Dr. Philish side of it, right? Are people overcompensating for not being able to celebrate? And I think why that's powerful is because it makes me think, I always think there's such a great tie to the fact that what we saw before COVID is this declining, like celebrations are happening differently, and memorialization, permanent memorialization is not happening. And that's been the trend, right? And so I think the two combined is what we're seeing. So you can't do a celebration. I'm going to overcompensate and do more on the memorial because I have to somehow pay tribute and give honor to this person whom I love. And so I think that's what's powerful there. Is that, yeah, those caskets, like high-end caskets, because we couldn't do a service, that correlation. And then going back to the monuments, I was talking to Mike Harns over at Cold Spring, and I said, is there any validity? Like, are you guys seeing anything like that? And what's interesting on the private mausoleum side is that they have more opportunities from 2020 than they've had, like at a greater numbers than they have ever had. So they are seeing more people think about that. Those are the large private mausoleums. So people are willing to spend more. In fact, they're hitting a record high for the three largest, most expensive private mausoleums are in 2020. So the people are building bigger and wanting to do more for some reason. Now, whether that's COVID related or not, I don't know. But I find that very interesting because it falls in line with this. What we're seeing on contracts is people paying on average $500 more for those monuments. And that just means they're doing more custom work on it and more personalization. That to me says a lot about what people really want and want to get out of celebrating someone's life. So, some things to consider from that are, Nelson already touched on them, updating our websites, updating the offerings that we're showing, not only on our websites, but in our marketing material. Make sure that people know that we're adapting and adjusting to the ever-changing market, not just during COVID, but as we go forward. One thing you can do, anyone who's a performance tracker client, is you could take your survey testimonials and use those in your marketing material. We just talked about reputation and online reputation and just recommendations. So when people see that other people are using you, we all know this, they're going to want to use you. So those testimonials are easy to pluck out of our system for sure. And then just, updating to make sure that everything that you're doing in your marketing is modern and it reflects the, traditional or non-traditional, but now it's today's modern buyer. Two things that I find that we want to be able to talk about and share are things that you say this a lot, Nelson. One of your favorite reports is the ability to look at a map and say, where are our contracts coming from, right? That's one thing. And then being able to also take feedback and use that as a tool to do some training. So let's kind of talk a little bit about that. Explain what this map does and why you use that with your clients.
So as it's called in Performance Tracker, is contract mapping. And what this is those of us that go back to an earlier time where we would have your local municipal map and we'd put pinpoints where all of our families were at. This is very interesting because we can actually, based upon different addresses that you normally collect, you're going to always collect the address of the death. You're going to collect the address of the decedent. Those are all on the death certificate, and obviously you're going to collect the address of the primary contract purchaser. This one that you're seeing right now is based upon the addresses of the primary contract person, the signer of the contract. And because again, what you're forecasting out is, these are the follow-up opportunities you have. This is a relatively high level. It'll give you the world perspective, and it'll give you right down to street level. But just to give you a understandable representation, this is mid-level, the so-called 30,000 foot probably. But it's also broken down into color-coded towards different types of services. We've seen really intriguing responses where people see clusters that are, traditional services, and others that are highly into cremation, or you'll see that maturing pre-need. And you just kind of wonder, somebody that looks at their own local map will be able to see, is there a senior center here? Is there a skewed senior population in this area? And is that why we see a cluster of pre-need, or why don't we see a cluster of pre-need there? Might be an area that you want to target. As I've been learning right along with everybody else this last year, the value of what websites are and how they can be targeting the audience around you. This is a very valuable map to provide your internet website provider when they identify just what your map looks like. And especially now, that creepy cool kind of thing. It's creepy that they know it, and it's cool that they know this kind of stuff. But to be able to really target in and see the people in the community and know the message that they can pull up on their normal Facebook feed and things like that. A lot of valuable information that's available here. Again, you can do it by hand if you go back to a earlier time that I started in, or you have it automated with something like this. So great tool, and just one that you really want to revisit. And so that's, it's a great piece of the overall picture when you're trying to look at what the future looks like.
Yeah, I think that difficult manual process, especially if you're breaking it up by the type of case call it is, or the contract type. That's what I think is so powerful. And you're right, you can zoom all the way into this. I know if I were to look at where I live, each neighborhood has its own little identity. So, that's like, you can almost predict what you think the kind of cases people would be, contracts people would be engaging in based on where they live. But to be able to actually see it and see some trends there and start defining what kind of direct marketing you want to do to those people would be very, very powerful. And we've seen that. The other thing that I think we can take away and learn from this is, how do you, how do you take the feedback that we're getting and use that information to start to train your staff? And one thing that I find very powerful is our word cloud. And Nelson, I know you've started to look at this. I know in our previous platform, we could find a word, we could search for one word. I remember I actually was doing a presentation on hospitality and catering, and I wanted to know how many people do catering, or how many times does that show up? And we actually did a word search just for words like catering and hospitality, and just saw how many people mentioned that in like a question of what's the most valuable thing about your services. Well, we now have this tool that actually pulls out the most used words in people's commentary and their surveys. And what's really cool about it is you can see the bigger words means that's how many times it's been mentioned in dissatisfaction surveys, right? And so we can even break them down by words that are used in positive surveys most often, in neutral surveys, and in negative surveys. And you might think, think, well, it says kind here. So why would they say, we were kind if it was a negative survey? We can click on that word and then it shows you all the surveys where that popped up and you start reading through what people are saying. A lot of time it's like, they weren't very kind to me. And so you can take that and it's just a really fun exercise, first of all, but it's also very insightful. And it's a good way to start talking to staff about the most important thing we should be measuring is customer sentiment. That's what we talk about now. It's not just understanding, like, did you like that? Or, tell us about this experience, 1 through 10. It's like, what was the feeling behind it? And that's the most important thing when we talk about customer experience is there's a feeling behind it. And so the sentiment is these words. So to be able to dig into them and then start adapting the kind of training that your people are getting based on what the customer feels they need is really, really powerful.
Something that I've seen too is earlier on, professionalism, professionalism, that was a larger word earlier on. And in a flip-flop of what you were illustrating, Lori, with regards to negative and kind, upset stands out, and that's actually in a positive area. This is, I think, another important thing to point out to everybody, and it's a cautionary tale that I've been kind of harping on for the last couple of months. Out of all the individual questions that we ask families that have been served, we talk in terms of different categories. 1, their initial contact. 2, the interaction that they had with their service professional, and then the facilities and the overall equipment and things like that. And then finally, the overall staff and engagement that they had with the overall experience. And of all those individual questions within those categories, the one that dropped the most in the last, I would say, 6 months is attention to detail. And I think we can all, appreciate that, when you have a call volume that went up 15, 20%, and you had people out, there's all those rationales for, well, it's crazy time and yeah, we're going to get things right or we're going to get things wrong. And that's true. But I think it's really important that we dial in on details for services. And I'm talking about liability changing details. When you think about the shift in direct cremation that's taken place, and if you fail in the details there of identification and transfer and presenting the cremated remains back to the family, those details can be huge. And again, I would spend an inordinate amount of time sitting down with your whole staff and making sure that everybody isn't letting the long-term effects of the pandemic lessen their resolve to do the absolute perfect job every single time, because it will have an impact if you end up with a lawsuit.
Yeah, and to that point, what you want to be able to do is take all this information and be able to use it to do really targeted training and make sure that you're hitting all the right parts of what people need in order to have the same level of service, regardless of or even with the volume of services that you're having to deal with, that the standard of care is still at the level that your organization has an expectation for, right? So what we've learned through the statistics is that training and retraining is more important than ever, because when you get busy, some of those little things start to drop off, like you're saying, attention to detail. We have proof of that. And so there's a few really valuable pieces in here, right? I also think that it's really interesting, younger generations of funeral directors stepping up to train on digital platforms and streaming services. So I know I said that fast, but what we know is happening is a lot of times in last year, because a lot of new technologies had to be adopted, a lot of the firms were relying on kind of the younger staff to help make those things happen. And I don't know if you have any commentary on that, Nelson, but we do know that from the staff perspective, it was like, oh, I was the one who had to be responsible for all this technology, and that's not what I'm here to do. And also, we know that while families appreciated that we adapted with technology, they still wanted a human touch, more of a human touch. So we have to be really careful with that and making sure that it didn't become a burden on the staff or on the families that we had a technology introduced to our processes, right?
That, in fact, there's another piece to that, and it's well, let me just say this: we don't operate within a bubble. So this whole presentation that we're talking about today is all about the information that we gather through our survey program and our contract analysis. But we are very privileged to be a part of a program earlier this year conducted by Iowa State University,
Mhm.
which specifically interviewed and surveyed those last responders and get death care workers. And what came out of that too was a very interesting thing is how stressful uh, these times were on the younger funeral directors. And I think there you saw a nice blending within the funeral homes where, yes, there's technology advances where the younger generation comes to the fore and we can probably tap into their skill sets that maybe an older generation of funeral directors, me being one of them, can really benefit from. But then you've got funeral directors that have been there and seen and been involved with, demort programs and plane crashes and just none of them had seen the original pandemic, the Spanish flu, but they've seen a lot. And I think that temperament of being through some difficult times, you think probably the biggest thing for funeral professionals prior to this pandemic, for those that are still operating, is no doubt the early 80s with the AIDS epidemic and the fear factor that went through the whole profession there. I think there was a wonderful blending, and I know, this was part of our summit, not this year, but previous year, and we had a big section on the blending of the older generation and the millennials. And I think we saw a wonderful thing happen this last year where that collective group of professionals came together and their abilities and their skill sets, although varied and different, came together to really produce a wonderful, responsive group professional, a bunch of professionals in a time where the world needed it most. And I think back over this year and I just can't be more proud to be part of the funeral profession and all those people that are out there. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I so agree. Much more the world really understood final responders and how much work has been put in, and I don't want to skip past this like fourth bullet here that funeral directors are dealing with even more emotional turmoil. So they're taking that home, taking it in more than ever, especially last year and still going forward right now. So just so proud of the profession in general, but also as a note, we need to make sure that we're caring for our employees and taking those extra steps to make sure they're emotionally okay as well. So some of the other takeaways to what the information that we've seen is back to the family's experience, and I like this kind of last bullet point here, Nelson, is even having one experience failed to meet the family's expectations. So one element of the entire experience, everything else went fine, but it was this one thing might have been more escalated or elevated, even emotionally, because of everything else that those families are dealing with last year. And I think so how a funeral home owner, or how you deal with that as a funeral home, to make sure that all of your staff is continuing to, excuse me on that, phone ringing, continuing to again serve at the same levels. There's a process for that, right? And so I'm hoping that you'll go through our customer experience cycle and how we can make sure that even when you have to make a change in your processes, that your service levels, how do you maintain service levels even if your processes had to change, which we saw a lot of last year.
Yeah, in fact, this kind of harkens back to what I was talking about before with paying attention to detail and making sure that we've got it down. You highlighted something that's very interesting. You know, when you read customer comments over a number of years and reading thousands of them, you'll see that oftentimes, you know, families put up with an awful lot. I've seen families that say, oh, they didn't do this and they didn't do that, and they still give the funeral home or the cemetery a 10
Mhm.
because they're forgiving and understanding. But I do think the stress of the pandemic, just to your point, there was maybe it's just that it was down to only a couple of things that you're able to do. And when it's down to just a couple of things, if one of those things is wrong, added onto the fact that, you know, the pandemic limited other things, yeah, it's interesting. It didn't take too much to put a family over the edge in these times, and that's why we've talked about we have a program pretty widespread, well understood or well known about our customer experience workshops that we do. This is only one aspect of the 2-day workshop that we do, but I think it's something that if we take a few minutes to explain, anybody can do this. Obviously, we'd be more than happy to facilitate this, but it's important enough that we wanted to share this just as a give back to the profession. Um, what we start off with is a basic assumption is these are our interactions with the family. It's the initial contact. We addressed that before, is that is always an area that's tremendously lacking in terms of satisfaction. Bringing into our care, the transfer, the remains into our care, making the arrangements, the gathering, visitation, ceremony, whatever that might be, whether it's a traditional religious service in a church, or even if it's just transferring cremated remains back into a family's care there at the funeral home. Final placement, again, whether that's a full burial or interment of cremated remains, and then obviously that ongoing continuous care. So we look at it from this standpoint. So the next slide, what we do is we take just one aspect of that. So for instance, if we are taking the initial contact, the center column, service standards in the yellow, it's what every employee can and should deliver to every customer. We put the term non-negotiable to it. I love that term because if you're sitting in any conversation and you say, Lori, this is non-negotiable, I think you get the point in a hurry that if you're going to work at this funeral home, this is something that's not up for debate. This is what we do every single time for every family, regardless of what their choices and decisions are. We're committed to this level of service or this level of accuracy. So that's your central feature. That's what every funeral home knows. You know, it's our way. You know, everybody has the quotes around, you know, whether it's Lori's way or Nelson's way. Every funeral home over the course of many generations, and in some cases hundreds of years, has come up with their way. That's usually not too hard to establish. The next two parts are important though, and that is to admit to service defects, admit to what happens that gets in the way of us being able to perform that every single time. And we encourage that to be a full-faced, you know, raw conversation, and that as owners especially, that you're open to the comments that may be, you know, maybe even offensive at times. You know, you don't provide us with this. We're running shorthanded. We don't have the proper equipment. Because again, if that's the way your team feels, they're certainly not providing the highest level of care to your families. And then on a more uplifting point is the above and beyond. Those are the things that set you apart from anybody else. You know, we always challenge everyone to say, you know, in terms of what you do, what is it that really puts you above your competition? And because when you really think down to it, the basic necessities of what one funeral home and one cemetery does that another one does, we fall pretty close in line with doing the same things. But in our customer service, we always talk about relationship is the one thing that cannot be duplicated. If I have Lori working at my funeral home, serving the families that come to my firm, nobody can duplicate Lori. And I say that on many levels. Nobody can duplicate Lori. She's the best. But if Lori's at my firm taking care of the families that come to my firm, uh, she's doing it in a special way that only Lori can ensure. They can't duplicate that at ABC Funeral Home down the street. And that's what we're always looking at, is that above and beyond, is to develop our team and our staff to look for opportunities to serve and capitalize on that. So if we jump to the next slide, give you a little better understanding. This is again, this is just an example of what you would do, but you'd have your service standards in the middle. And then again, that bold-faced, honest reality check on, yeah, this is what happens and this is why it doesn't work every single day, every single time with every single family. And then again, the above and beyond, that's the things that we want to strive for. This should be a living document and it should be revisited often and many times throughout the course of the year, because you're always trying to reduce and eliminate the defects, obviously, and you're always trying to take the above and beyond and incorporate them into your service standards. And I suggest this oftentimes with multi-location firms. I think anybody out there, if you look within yourself and you say this honestly, you probably don't have every single location operating identical to the sister firm or the main branch or something like that. And we see variations in services that come about, sometimes in a negative way, but sometimes in a very positive way, that for some reason, the funeral directors at this location or the cemetery workers in this particular area have started to do something and they've just kind of kept it to themselves. But when we talk and we find about that, we say, you know what, this is a great thing that the company should adopt. And those can always be those things that you're constantly improving on your services. So again, think about this in terms of the attention to detail. If people are not following and doing those non-negotiables when it comes to IDing the decedent, if that's something that everybody can't commit to on a 100% level, that's something that you would take note of and start fixing that immediately.
Yeah, and what I like about Nelson is that you don't just do this as an owner and leadership, right? I mean, you're engaging everybody in this process because, to your point, one person at one location could be doing something that is above and beyond that should just be a standard for everybody. And you only learn that when you engage everybody in this process. It's such a powerful exercise. And I want to just go back and reemphasize how powerful, how even more powerful it is if you're taking customer feedback and applying it to something like the service defects, right? So a lot of times you might all sit together and go, oh, this could go wrong, and you're just kind of brainstorming. But if you actually take your negative feedback from your surveys and apply it to, oh, well, that did happen. And a lot of times, once again, you get negative feedback and you go, well, that happened because of whatever. And you almost disregard it or you get defensive about it. Like Nelson said, it takes, it's pretty courageous. You got to be bold enough to go like, yeah, that is an issue. We know that it is. And now let's make sure that we list it as a service defect so we can plan for it not happening again and putting it into our experience cycle so that we're trying to mitigate that every single time, not just letting it be a thing that we just cast off as like, oh, that just happened, right? And that's that. So again, this is such a powerful exercise, and it's something, like you said, Nelson, that anyone can do. It just takes time to get everyone together to do it and be really honest.
Yeah, and we talk about this all the time. It's accountability, and that's probably the biggest thing that we bring to any relationship, is that coaching accountability, to actually do this and maintain it and revisit it over and over. That's the key. The process itself is easy to understand. It's the commitment to continuing it is the big part.
Yeah, and I think that can happen all the time, especially when you say, "Well, we've been doing it for 100 years or over 100 years, so we know what we're doing." So to keep up.
Or there's owners who have said, "Oh, we've been doing that for 100 years," and all of a sudden they find out that it's not being done anymore.
Okay.
And that's a natural progression of time too, is where all of a sudden I'm not the guy that's training everybody that comes and joins the firm. Now I've delegated that to somebody else, and all of a sudden somebody else's isn't the same standards, or maybe they thought something that I thought was important wasn't. Next thing you know, you've got people that are being trained into, employee number one's way of doing it. They're not really running your funeral home way. They're running somebody else's adapted version. And
Right.
that's critical to see, what the result of your internal training is, because it's not always what you think it might be.
Yeah. Well, we are coming up to the hour, and so I want to wrap up. I know we've had some questions. I don't see anything else in the chat box. If anyone else has any other questions, I'd love to take them. We'd love to take them. We have some final notes on here, just some additional things to consider, looking at some of the information that we've shared today. Again, anyone who's actually on this live right now, we'll go ahead and send this report out to you. And obviously the recording, but if there's any other information or questions or thoughts that you have, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to take those. I don't see any other questions in here. Nelson, any final thoughts on just overall what we learned and how we're using that to help improve performance across even the clients that you're working with?
The big takeaway that I had over the course of the last year is the adaptability of funeral home and cemetery personnel. It's been a wonderful thing. I think if we all look at ourselves, and I think for years and years and years, people typically would talk about the funeral profession as something very slow to adapt. And in some cases, we need to own that. When you think about streaming services that are all of a sudden, everybody's streaming services, but that's been around for 20 years. That's nothing new. And so, yeah, shame on us that we didn't embrace that before. But when it was a necessity, oh man, I mean, literally within weeks, I saw everybody transitioning, and they found the technology that was out there waiting for them. And I guess the only thing is, I would say, is let's not wait for the next disaster or the next stressor that's put on our profession. Constantly keep yourself apprised of what's happening out there. Things that seem crazy to you right now may be the normal way of doing business in the future. I can't even imagine a time back in my history where I would have thought it was a natural thing to dial up somebody on a computer and make their arrangements with them. And now, that's an accepted norm that we've come to embrace. And sometimes for families who their first time experience ever has been making arrangements that way. So that's not a new norm for them. That's just the norm.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of this is let's not wait for the next disaster to happen to be on the cutting edge there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, technology is moving lightning years faster than it ever has, and that's just going to continue, especially into this new decade or into this whole decade. And so I think that is the key to everything right now is we all need to be able to adapt and move and make changes quickly. And that's pretty painful for a lot of people, but the more that we get used to change being the norm, just change in general being the norm, the better we're going to be for our staff, for our businesses, health, and for the customers we serve. So we will continue to gather information and statistics and data as much as we can and share it with all of you. And we certainly will share this. And we appreciate you sharing your time with us today. Thanks for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.